Hi, hello, and welcome to the library. Hi, Sigi. Thank you for the 14 years immediately. Thank you very much. Don't worry about not being here. I hope that you have fun and your experiment is going perfectly. But hi, for I wanted to say special stream is not exactly a special stream. This is kind of like a let's read together / lecture. I don't exactly know how it will happen, and how it will shape like this session. But this is like an educational stream today. So I hope you're doing very, very good today. I don't want to lose too much time because we might have a lot to cover, especially as I intend this to be kind of like an introduction to sociology. So there is a lot of things we want to talk about, methodology and stuff. You might watch the VOD at a later date though, feel free to. But yeah, you can focus on your things. I think it's more important than being on a random stream on the internet. But thank you for coming. Okay, so today the topic, I think it's the title of the stream. We want to explore and kind of understand how unemployment is affecting well-being. And to explore this question, I want to take a very famous study that was done in the early 30s by a group of researchers that you can see here, Marie Jahoda, Paul F. Lazartsfeld, and Hans Zeissel. We really have crazy people in here. You can be banned. So a group of 3 researchers that did, let's say, sociology, sociography study in a village or a district called Marienthal. And they used new methods, let's say, that became very popular, very important in order to shape the field of sociology. Because we are in the early 30s, obviously we had sociologists before, researchers before, but the methods were still very blurry. And this is kind of a foundational studies that was really noted for its methodology and its conclusions. And nowadays, this is a classic of sociology. If you take if you want to graduate in sociology, you'll go into your curriculum, and this is one of the first book that will be talked about. You might learn about, I don't know, Mead. You can learn about Durkheim, about, I don't know, Bourdieu or whatever. But you'll find most likely a little session, a little part of the course on Marienthal. And nowadays, the conclusions that have been drawn by this book are very much accepted by a lot of people. We had new studies that focused on unemployment and on well-being, and seeing the reaction to people to unemployment that are corroborating those early findings on Marienthal. What is very important also, I want to note immediately, is that the question that we'll answer today feels almost like a psychology question, right? How unemployment does affect well-being. And there might be a question that we can ask immediately: what's the difference between sociology and psychology? Or let's say social psychology. I don't think that the difference is that critical, in that we are looking at the same phenomenon. the method and the focus will be a little bit different. To simplify things, I would say that like social psychology is really the study of an individual within the group. So the focus is on the individual. In sociology, the focus is on the group. And obviously, in sociology, we have different methods. We do acknowledge that the group has an influence on the individual, but that the individual has an influence on the group as well. That's what we called interaction, symbolic interaction. But yeah, sociology is more concerned about, let's say, high level or very like broad scale analysis of groups, more than like a very specific individual and trying to understand like how he or they behaved very like in their daily life. So this is like a long book, obviously, and I've taken like one chapter of it. So I want us to focus on like chapter 5. I'll explain what chapter 5 is a little bit after. And I've also selected like the beginning of like chapter 7, just because it is very interesting, like to showcase like the different methods and observations that researchers are doing on the field to collect like data. I think this is like one of the most important things we need to look at today. Obviously, I want to answer the main question, but this is also like a showcase of like methodology of like how do we do sociology on the field, and is sociology a science in the sense that like it's empirical. And let's be very clear immediately. Yes, sociology is empirical. Empirical. We do have not necessarily like experiments on the field, but we make like observation and we collect data by understanding that we cannot control necessarily like the experiment. We don't have like control groups. The world entire is a running experiment, and we just like look at it as much as we can. So in a way, it's what we call the very like inductive science, in the sense that observation of the real world are driving analysis, theories, whatever. And then we might use like those theories to interpret data. Again, we have some sort of like paradigm that will shed a certain light on a phenomenon, but obviously we can like treat a phenomenon through different perspectives, and we might arrive at like slightly different conclusions. Okay, so before we begin like reading the chapter, it's like 9 pages, something like that. I want to talk a little bit about like why do we do like an analysis, a survey of like Marienthal? Why did they do that like in the early 30s? Well, you see, at this time, obviously, in the early 30s, we are in a very like difficult time in Europe, in the West, because the financial crisis of 29 had far-reaching like effects on everybody. And we see in Europe the rise of like unemployment, and especially in Germany, that barely recovered from the First World War. The financial crisis is kind of like putting a stop to the reconstruction efforts, and unemployment is flaring in a very like critical way. And you have in Germany, in France, in Austria, and in a lot of different places, early studies or like surveys that are trying to have a better picture of unemployment, trying to understand what happened, to what conditions drove people to unemployment, and also how people were adjusting to it. And this is the case with a study that was set in Austria. So Marienthal is situated located in the south of Vienna, the capital. And the study was done by a group of researchers from Vienna. You can see the names here. They all were working at the Wirtschaft Soziologischen Forschungsstelle in Vienna, so the research center of, let's say, sociological or social economy, economical sociology, whatever. So this mix of like economy and social like studies. All of them were working here, but they had like different backgrounds. Leds Asfeld was really focused on mathematics. Yahoda was more focused on pedagogy and psychology, while Zeisel was studying law, basically like economy, the economy of the state economy, rights, law of Austria. And they came together to do this study about unemployment. I will say the early study was not meant to be about unemployment. Lazartsfeld wanted to do a study on leisure, but because all of them had ties to basically like political like parties and unions and stuff like this, they were told that this would be in the current conditions, so the early 30s, it would be very weird to do such a study and not focus on unemployment, which was the big political question at that time. So Lazartsfeld decided to shift the focus of this study into like unemployment, but really also by looking at leisure during unemployment. And I think this is kind of like the very special thing that we'll see like in this study. They were not alone in doing this field work. They had like approximately like 15 people joining them, all from like different, let's say, specialties. And each of them would like handle some part of like the survey on some like very specific questions or measurements that would fit their specialty. And we'll see that they had done like an absurd quantity of field work and observation, pseudo experiments, interviews that are covering like a lot of ground, maybe too much, would we say, but it gives like for a very like vivid portrayal of Marienthal at that time. Just like a word again, like on the historical and economic context of Marienthal before like we jump into the observation of like why people or how people are behaving during unemployment. So what is very important to note and to remember is that Marienthal was very early, like immediately at the beginning of like the 19th century, Marienthal became a village, a district that was quite industrial. There was like a flax mill that was built in 1830, and a lot of people came to work on this like factory. And this village was very monotonous in a way. People, we have like different descriptions, and people say that like the houses looked all the same, long, single single-story houses, and you had people from Austria, but you also had like immigrant workers from, Czech workers, Bohemian workers, German workers in general, that would come here to work in this factory. And obviously the factory started to grow more and more, and it diversified its activities to the point it became the main economic focus of the city, of the village. You had people working in the fields, obviously, but most of like the inhabitants or people staying there to work were working on the factory. And we can like guess that by the time the factory closed, it was approximately like 80 to 90% of people that were depending directly on this factory. And so when you had the financial crisis in 29, the factory tried to survive, but ultimately closed. And all the people went immediately into unemployment. And this is this very high level of unemployment that was interesting to Lattersfeld and his colleagues. And they wanted to understand the effect of such a mass unemployment on what is a pretty small community. We had like 1,500 people living there approximately. Before we talk about like methodology and what was the approach between quantitative and qualitative data, I want us to start reading the chapter 5, and try to see the effects of unemployment on the community. So I'll try to read things for you, and we'll stop at certain points to kind of like talk about the previous paragraph and stuff. So now that we have sketched the economic history of Marienthal and its present economic condition, it is time to take a closer look at life in the village. The chief impression is one of blunting monotony. What we were to encounter later in endless variations was already present at the beginning, in a scene both monotonous and still. People are living here who have become accustomed to owning less, doing less, and expecting less than they had considered essential to life in earlier days. To assess the extent to which Marienthal had been changed by unemployment, we had to learn something about the atmosphere and life of the community had been like during normal times. People were more than willing to describe Marienthal as it had been when it was still at work. Frau P. Well, it used to be magnificent in Marienthal before. Just going to the factory made a change. During the summer, we used to go for walks and all those dances. No, I don't feel like going out anymore. Frau L. I met my husband in Bruck when he was in the army. I went there with our soccer club. In those days, the whole of Marienthal used to go along with the club when the club was playing out of town. Frau S. In the old days, the children always got lovely things, clothes and toys, everything they wanted. Before Christmas, I always went shopping in Vienna. R.E. I often used to go dancing with my wife. There was life in Marienthal then. Now the whole place is dead. Links with Vienna had been close. Every self-respecting citizen of Marienthal used to go to Vienna with his wife at least once a week, either to the theater or somewhere else. Especially before Christmas, people went to Vienna to do their shopping, and many children were sent to school in the city. Marienthal itself had been teeming with life. The fairs and dances, particularly during the carnival season, soon made a name for the village in the surrounding country as a place where people knew how to live. Marienthal was even the fashion center for the neighboring villages. So this is like a very interesting thing to keep in mind. First of all, methodology-wise, you can see that you had interviews with people be it on the street or being invited by them. This is what we would say is qualitative. Because here we are like specifically asking about like ways of life, things that cannot be quantified, behaviors. And obviously you could try to quantify that into like who stays at home back then and who go outside to, you know, go to the fairs, to the dances, or to go to Vienna. But generally those interviews are pretty qualitative. It's not about number data, it's more about the quality and the abstractness of those like behaviors. We can't quantify them. So note how like this entire village feels like very happy back then, because the factory was fueling most people. People were probably paid a good amount, and they had like enough means to go to Vienna every week to enjoy theater, other things, to do shopping, and this like little sentence here was even the fashion center for neighboring villages, probably because the means of people were enough so that could buy like good clothes in Vienna, and other villages that were only, let's say, farming villages would see the economic ripples of the factory and how people were better dressed and all. By the same token, I continue to read, the political organization had been very active. People used to read a lot, entered eagerly into discussions, and enjoyed organizing a variety of events. The focus of this lively community was the factory, which was not simply a place of work, it was the center of social life. Herr L. When I came back, I did not feel like continuing as a cobbler. I wanted to work in the factory. Life was better there. As a cobbler, you sit all day long with the same 2 or 3 people. In the factory, it's quite different. You have a great many challenges, and when work is over, you're free and can live up a little. How W. Although I had to work harder in the factory, I liked that sort of life. I enjoyed working and wasn't stuck in one place all the time. So what you can see like immediately is that the factory was seen as a better employment place as other than other jobs. And by the same token, the factory was also seen as a location, a site of sociabilities. That's where you go to spend time with people, you're surrounded by people, and you do things together. They mentioned political organizations, obviously, because we had unions. You had like all the socialist ideas that were teeming in those groups. People were reading, people were using the communal library, people discussed about politics or other things, and they organized activities as workers and for the workers, so as like a big community. So the factory, again, was not simply a place of work, it was a place of communal belonging. And this is kind of like the central point that like this study is making, is that like there's something shameful in being unemployed, and there's also the situation where you don't have a place to go every day to talk with other people, which is a problem that we see also like in today's society. And most studies that focused on unemployment, you know, after like this seminal study in the 50s, in the 80s, they all agreed that unemployment also meant the dislocation of traditional solidarities. So that's the picture of Marienthal when the factory was here. But all of this has now disappeared. Silence has come to the factory. Somewhere across the empty courtyards, one can hear at times the thud of a hammer knocking old bricks out of a wall. That is the last job the factory has to offer. So by the idea is that like the only job left for the factory is dismantling the factory. Opposite the factory lies a large park which formerly belonged to the manor. The people of Marienthal once were very proud of it. On Sundays, they sat on the benches that bordered the drive with its carefully trimmed shrubs, or walked along the well-tended footpath. Now the park is a wilderness. The paths are overgrown with weeds, and the lawns are ruined. Although almost everyone in Marienthal had enough free time, no one looks after the park. The Montessori nursery school, which the workers of Marienthal built for their children, had to close down because it could no longer pay the teacher. The toys and games, well wrapped, are stowed in a trunk in the workers' club. At first, the people of Marienthal hoped that all this idleness would simply end before long. Until recently, there were repeated rumors of a Czech industrialist who allegedly was interested in restarting the looms. But hardly anyone believes that any longer. Nobody expects a change. How? Let's stop here. So, again, I think a very interesting observation that is kind of like at the center of a sociological study. When you do like sociology, of course you can do sociology like, in your armchair and do it like as a purely like intellectual and abstract work. But I think that this particular attitude is kind of an attitude of blindness, because it's an abstraction that is not rooted in reality. When you do sociology, you have to be like on the field to some extent. And it's very common for us to have like notebooks where we'll like take different notes on what we are observing. And what I used to do personally was that like I wrote in different colors the things that I was observing and analyzing. You have purely observational notes that are purely descriptive or just notes from like interviews, what people are saying to you directly without like twisting their words. And then you would have like the more methodological analytical part. So my methodological notes were in a different color, and I would like put that like on the top of like my notebook, like the page of my notebook, being like, why am I doing like this particular observation? What's the plan with being here or asking like those questions? What kind of like ideas do I want to get? And what's the purpose of this the time that I'm spending here? And then in another color, I would have analytic notes. Those notes were it's already like one level beyond, because instead of like purely observing, I'm creating ideas. I'm submitting hypotheses about the situation. So here, for example, if we take like this particular thing, the observational note would be the description of the park, description of like the school as well. Even like people saying that like they don't believe like in a change or whatever, that could be observational, because it comes from what people are saying to you. Oh, do you expect like things to become better? They say no. Analytical notes, for example, is where is it? Although almost everyone in Marienthal had enough free time, no one looks after the park. That is starting to veer into analytical notes. And I would say the theory, the hypothesis would be that people are too depressed to, put that like very simply, people are too depressed to give their time to take care of like the park. Even with their free time, their mental state does not allow them to do like this activity that was central to their previous life, by taking care like of a place that people would like visit often after after working at the factory. This relates to a concept that we call anomie to some extent. I don't want to talk about anomie because this is the whole entire thing, and we don't have the time today. But you can see like hypotheses, ideas that are flaring just from like observation, and that need to be confirmed by like more observation. That is like the scientific method for sociology. Sociology is a science that is very well rooted in observation, in empirical data collection. The problem is that like we cannot recreate the condition of an experiment, and we cannot really prove like that something is that the experiments can be falsified, because we don't have like a control group, to put it simply. We don't have the means to like replicate like the exact same sociological situation every time. So we do collect data and we try to create like hypotheses from there that we try to check afterwards by collecting more data. But everything is kind of like an approximation. It's trying to find like the best theory, the most accurate theory for all the data that we have gathered. And obviously this is not like too dissimilar to what we're doing like in natural science, right? Like physics is doing the exact same thing, because you have this theory of classical physics with like Newtonian physics, and it works very well for, you know, most macro behaviors or macro like phenomenons. But when you get into like the microscopic world, you see that like those rules start to break up, and you need like to learn about you see like quantum behaviors, and even like at the macro level you have theories that or observation that cannot be understood within the framework of Newtonian physics, because you need to apply relativity to understand them. So depending on the data that we get, we try to make new theories emerge, and this is always like a cumulative work. What is the difference with sociology is that it's a little bit less cumulative than natural science, because our theories are very abstract. We only try to give like a descriptive approach, a descriptive theory of things, and sometimes theories can completely shift depending on like new data, evolution in society, or whatever. So to go back like to the study of like Marienthal, yes, the idea is here to, well, the hypothesis is that people are too quote unquote depressed to look at to look after the park, and now we need to like pile up new data to kind of like try to understand or to verify if our hypothesis makes sense or not. I think it's less a question of like being true. It's more of a question of like, does it make sense? And does it help us understand the society and the groups that we're trying to study? So let's continue. How this general decline affects the various cultural activities of the unemployed is apparent in some of the conversations, so qualitative again. Some of the conversations we had with officers of the cultural institutions of Marienthal. The manager of the theatre club, for instance, told us, the biggest difference between then and now is that the actors no longer have the same kind of enthusiasm. One has to force them to act. Because of the misery, their hearts are not in it any longer. Some of the better actors have left altogether. Although they all would have much more time for the theatre now, people have lost interest. the theatre club won't have to shut down, but one has to try much harder to get anything out of the people. So again, this idea of lack of enthusiasm, depression, resignation, that is corroborated by another interview, another qualitative interview. And then we can try to check at quantitative data. The records of the Marienthal's Workers' Library also show a decline in activity. The number of loans dropped from 1929 to 1931 by 49%, although the former borrowing charge has now been abolished. It is primarily the number of readers that has decreased, but even the few who continue to use the library are reading fewer books than before. And you can see here the numbers for this drop in volumes read per reader per year. And you see, of course, like a drastic diminution by half between, well, in 2 years, in the 2 years that followed the closing of the factory. So there is this kind of fog that is covering the people of Marienthal. They don't find joy in activities, and they have a lot of free time, but this time is not used in a productive fashion. Productive in the sense of leisure activities that make sense and that better them as individuals. They don't act, they don't have, demanding activities, be it like physical, like tending the gardens, or intellectual, like reading or acting. And this shift of behavior is why the conclusion of like the researchers in Marienthal was that unemployment gives free time, but it doesn't make revolutionary subject, right? Because at that time, with like the communists, the idea, of course, was to further the agenda of like a revolution of like the proletariat to some extent, or at least like working towards the rights of workers and employees. But instead of the myths of, oh, if you are unemployed, if you have been dominated by society, you are angry enough to rebel against the government, the current situation, or whatever, you see here that like, no, people don't have like the energy anymore to commit into those activities. Instead, they kind of like wither in all front. And we'll see like more data below that is kind of like going in the same direction. So this decline reflects a falling off of interest and not a lack of books in a library whose potential might soon have been exhausted. Shortly before the factory closed, the stock of books had been enlarged by the acquisition of a library from a neighboring village, and yet the figures still went down. It is often assumed that the unemployed do not use their time to further their education, but the problem is not so simple. So the analytic part of this argument. If one sees in their situation merely an abundance of time and nothing more, then one will probably be surprised by their reduced interest in reading. That's what we said. However, if one views their whole psychological situation and not just one aspect of it, then these figures simply confirm what we know of the basic situation. The people themselves are often aware of this. Herr S. I spend most of my spare time at home. Since I have been out of work, I hardly read at all. One doesn't feel like it anymore. Oh, S. I used to read a lot. I knew most of the books in the library. Now I read less. God knows we have other problems these days. Because of also like a situation that like can be explained in like economic terms. We have not like seen them because they were in the previous chapters, but you can see here in those like two answers something that is very interesting. you see the man saying that like he is very idle. He spends time at home, right? He feels like sluggish. The lady is saying we have other problems these days. What is very interesting in this situation of like unemployment is that it doesn't affect, and I don't think like we'll see that much in this chapter, unless I'm mistaken, but there is like a plurifactorial issue at hand here. Yes, unemployment is one variable, but the other variable at play between those like two things is the gender of the interviewee. The man is staying idle, the woman seems to say that they have other problems, and probably because she is still the one taking care of the household. In a certain way, and this is what like the study of Marienthal is showing, is that the imposition of traditional gender roles onto like women, they have to take care of the household, to clean, to do like the education of like the children, they have to cook. This will still like shape their life with a very like concrete cycle, time cycle, schedule. And because of that, they still stay active. So they are unemployed, but they are not, but they still work in a sense, right? It's just that their work is unpaid, which is, you know, the thing with like domestic economies, like the classification of like unemployment is a concept that has been invented, and you have to fit a very specific category to be unemployed, right? It's not just about like work, it's about where you work and what type of work you do. And in this situation, the man is not working, is unemployed and not working, but the woman is unemployed but still working because she has to deal with like the house and still trying to make the entire household stand together, even with like the reduction of wages because of unemployment. What is not necessarily said in this study, or at least in this chapter, is that there is unemployment benefits at this time in Austria. The problem is that they were very low compared like to the wages that a worker could have in a factory. So you're probably making money, but you're making probably half of the money through those like unemployment benefits, and they are like mixed between, sometimes it's like the city, sometimes it's kind of like the union that is coming to help. But you understand that like if the unemployment benefits is coming from the city and the city is collapsing, then there's a cycle of like misery and poverty that is going on right here. So yeah, again here, a very like qualitative difference between the two, and something that is said very often in the study of Marienthal. So the following pages will show how a number of institutions have been radically changed by the decline of cultural life, and how these changes penetrate deeply into the private lives of the unemployed. The area in which this manifests itself most clearly is politics. A leading political functionary of Marienthal reflected the general attitude in these words. I used to read the Arbeiter Zeitung, so the newspaper, like the newspaper for the workers. From the first line to the last, no, I just flip through it and then throw it away, even though I have more time. So they say, the central organ of the Austrian Social Democratic Party, whose extensive political section and general intellectual level makes rather high demands on the working class reader. The Catholic organizations, from whom we could not obtain precise figures because their meetings were always attended by a few people from the rural vicinity as well, showed a similar decline in the number of people who came to meetings from Marienthal So even like political studies, political discussions, readings were not seen as interesting anymore. Unemployment doesn't make revolutionary subject, it makes resigned people. So the number of subscription dropped, quantitative data, by 16% between 27 and 30. This must not, as one might assume, be a simple economy measure, for the Arbeitszeitung had a special subscription rate for the unemployed of only 4 Groschen per copy. It was interest in politics that had declined. And that we know from... You can see how they are mixing like quantitative data with qualitative data, right? Observation, empirical, quantitative. The number of subscription dropped. Now you have different like hypotheses that can come to mind. You can say that like, oh, this is because the journal is too expensive. And they say, no, because we have qualitative data that tells us a different story. We know from this person that he's still reading the Arbeitszeitung, and probably all the people are still like reading the Arbeiterzeitung, or most of them are, but they are just not interested. And because we have also the lack of attendance at political meetings, we have to shift the hypothesis. This is not a question of economy, this is a question of interest. And that ties again with the previous elements that we had found with this depression, resignation, anomie that is wrapping the entirety of Marienthal. So the Kleine Blatt, of the same political persuasion but generally geared toward entertainment rather than politics, lost only 27% of its subscribers, and that despite its higher price. So here the argument is that it's really like political matters that were not interesting. So for going like towards this hypothesis of disinterest. We gain further insight into the specific forms of this decline in interest from the membership figures of certain organizations in Marienthal. Most of these organizations, one must remember, are of a thoroughly political nature and closely affiliated with the respective political parties. Only the Social Democratic Party possesses an extensive political organization. For other parties, a focal point is provided by various cultural clubs. For those with a German national bias, for example, it is the German Turnverein, the athletic club, and for the older men of German Gesangsverein, the glee club that provides this sort of rallying point. They all lost membership between 27 and 31, the Social Democratic Party 33%, the Turnverein 52%, and the Gesangsverein 62%. Since all the organizations reduced their membership fees for unemployed members to a nominal level, financial sacrifice cannot have been the decisive factor. This will become even clearer since the membership of some organizations actually kept growing. All political organizations suffered heavy losses. Differences in the rate of decline reflect partly the different degrees of party discipline. Discipline was stronger in the Social Democratic Party because of its political tradition, and in the Turnverein on account of its semi-military structure. The Gesangsverein was the first to suffer since its members came mainly from the factory's white-collar staff, who left Marienthal immediately after the plant closed down. So a lot of like nuances here that we need to keep in mind. Especially, and because I want to take a look at another example after that, they say that the difference was partly party discipline. And this is what, in some cases, is making the difference between an unsuccessful movement of the unemployed and a successful one. One very interesting study that we have in France is the movement, the unemployment movement in 1997-98, where people basically used to storm in the ascetic buildings, ascetic being like the, at that time, prime, the organization that was responsible of like unemployment benefits. And you had like unemployed people coming there, storming in the buildings and occupying those things for a very long time, and they kind of won on the things that they were asking for. And this is, I think, like a very interesting success that feels that is almost like defying the odds, because at that time, all the sociologists were in agreement that the observations that were made in Marienthal were basically like the most common way for a community to react to unemployment. This is the breakdown of solidarities and people dropping out of political organization. But in France, in 97, 98, we had like this very vivid movement where unemployed people were also helped by other leftist organizations in their reivindications, in their fight and struggle against the French administration. And because they were still like in a very deep group, like, you know, broader organization of people coming to help them, they kept those like social links, and they did not struggle that much with resignation, as we see here in Marienthal. And studies of like that movement in 97, 98 focus very much on like the role of the group as a cohesive force that stops people from drifting away and from losing hope. Okay, but to go back on Marienthal, particularly when political parties organized charities, people occasionally tried to benefit from all sides. A few men had actually become members of both politically opposed organizations. However, contacts within the community were so close that such duplicity was quickly discovered. It seems that especially among the younger people, the few who are still politically active are those who still have work. The local branch of the Young Socialist Workers has 37 members, only 7 of whom are unemployed. When one of their officers lost his job, he resigned from his position and decided to give up politics entirely. Again, because the praxis of activism and socialism is very much something for the workers. At that time, those leftist organizations didn't exactly know how to handle unemployment, and that's why also the study of Marienthal was done. Again, I said at the beginning, the researchers were linked to the those activist-like parties. And the choice of focusing on unemployment was to understand how people would react to it, and for like the political parties, how they needed to act in order like to recapture the votes of those people and also their support at a political level. So this study of Marienthal, as much as this is like a work of sociology, was also very much linked to politics in some ways, because it is fighting, to quote like Bourdieu, for the good cause. It tries to like find or write conclusions that would help politicians and associations, worker groups, unions to make educated decisions to fight unemployment, or to ask for the right things that those people needed at that time. So yeah, we see that unemployed people spend less time in politics, and that has like far-reaching effects and kind of like a domino effects on the activity in the town. So the people are very much aware of this decline in political activities. The functionaries of all parties agree that political hostilities among the inhabitants have abated considerably since the period of unemployment began. Nobody is spending time in those like political groups anymore, so there's no need like to argue within or amongst neighbors. This fact, which so curiously contradicts everything that is happening in Germany in 32, probably derives from the peculiar uniform and hence unifying situation in Marienthal. Everyone, whatever his political affiliation, bears the same lot. However, it is also possible that the peculiarities in the Austrian national temperament play their part. I don't want to dive into psychological studies of like a national temperament. I think this is like very much like of a blurry thing, and it stayed like an argument in many like sociological and anthropological work until at least like the 80s. I don't like it because it doesn't seem very much driven by empirical data. That there is maybe like a temperament at the scale of a village, I can believe it to some extent. But a national temperament, I think it's very difficult to study and to generalize. So I won't comment on that. I don't think it should be like an argument in this particular situation. Or if it is, you need like better, you need data to back that up, like what the Austrian national temperament is. And right now it's like very unclear. I do agree though with the explanation that like there's a uniformity in Marienthal because everyone is suffering from the unemployment. A lot of people were workers in the factory. And this is quite clear that there is just no driver for political conflict or for political like discussions in here. So in the old days, political fistfights after party meetings were by no means rare, but during the 1932 election campaign for the Provincial Assembly, which throughout the country was conducted with considerable heat, all that happened in Marienthal was the destruction of a few posters. Otherwise, the campaign proceeded very calmly. It is not possible to foresee whether this tendency toward moderation of the traditional political differences will be upset by new political developments, for instance by the growth of the recently founded local branch of the National Socialist Party, so the Nazis. Again, here I think what is very interesting, like in this particular line of reasoning, is that they are trying to. So observational data is that like you have less violence in Marienthal when it comes to political disagreement. The problem is that we lack, or at least this study lacks more qualitative and quantitative data to make a really educated guess. So it stays at a very like descriptive level, like people, it probably derives from the uniformity. That's, you know, the hypothesis that feels like the most likely at that point in the reasoning. But at the same time, like we just don't have like anything to corroborate this hypothesis and make it a strong one. And I think this is like also like a big thing in sociology. Obviously, we have like our different approach, the same way like we have people that are more positivist, so more driven on like observation, and other people more on the theory side. You have people that will be like more descriptive and people that want to like shape big theories about society. I personally have always, because of the authors that were very important to me and also like my education in university, I fall towards like the descriptive group more than the big theory group, because I think that like you have so much nuance at a local level that it's very difficult to shape big theories. And here you can see that like it's a very local description. It doesn't try to say anything about like unemployment in Austria in general, he talks about Marienthal and how this particular situation, this particular unemployment in Marienthal shapes behaviors. We don't have like a clear-cut theory to explain everything, but we can make like educated guesses, and also leave them at like guesses until someone is like conducting like another survey or whatever. Obviously, the big difference in sociology and social science in general is that like this like Marienthal of like the early 30s, we cannot return to it, so we cannot like make more experiment or gather more data about it. Or maybe we can gather data if like people had written like journals or diaries about their life, but basically like the study of like Marienthal at that time is closed, and there are things that we will never know, which I think is like an interesting point in history, in sociology, and anthropology, is that like there are mentalities, there are states of the mind that are just inaccessible for us most of the time. For example, like we cannot access the mind of ancient Egyptians right now. We can like find maybe inscriptions or writings where they're talking about their lives or whatever, but they are so minimal, they are so like unique that it gives like maybe the perspective of like one person, but we cannot like make a study of like mentalities for an entire population from it. And this idea of like part of the past being inaccessible, I think is very interesting. And in sociology, even if we do like inquiries and surveys and interviews and studies in the present, the moment your interview is finished, you have lost something that will never be opened again. Like you cannot like open in the exact same way like those conditions, and ask questions that you wanted to ask 6 months before, because then like life in this locale is changing and you don't know how people are evolving. And that is, I think, like a very interesting like approach to science and like our own limitations, that kind of like makes our methodology a little bit different, even though like we still try to apply a scientific method. Okay. The picture presented by the organizations that have not suffered from the crisis is equally instructive. The Socialist Children's Friends showed the membership decline of only 25% over the years 27 to 31. The membership of the Workers' Cycling Club remained unchanged, and two organizations even registered considerable growth: the Catholic organization Happy Childhood and the Social Democratic Cremation Society, Die Flamme, the latter showing an increase of 19% during that period. It is not difficult to interpret those figures. So again, we start by quantitative data, and now this is the time for a hypothesis. The last three organizations offer their members more or less direct financial advantages. The cycling club facilitates insurance payments for the bicycles that are being so carefully maintained by their owners. Know that no one can afford the railroad any longer. The bicycle remains the last link with the outside world, the only place where one might still find a job. The organization Happy Childhood runs a nursery school, and a modest contribution to the Cremation Society prevents the inevitable disruption of an already restricted budget in the event of death. The general conclusion is fairly obvious. As privation increases, organization membership becomes less of a matter of conviction and more of a matter of financial interest. This does not mean that the loyalties and convictions have changed. They have merely lost their motivating power in the face of the pressures of the day. It is as if the cultural values invested in the political struggle have been ossified or given away once again to primitive forms of conflict. The election results clearly reveal the political situation. And we'll take a look at this just a little bit after, because this is also like a big part of sociology work. It's those like tables and kind of like interpreting those tables. So to go back like on this, this is a very interesting like fixture of unemployment and also like poverty in general. And I think like it almost comes from like a logical, like a very like obvious, observation, right? Like when people have less money, they tend to like be a bit more selective in what they find like useful. It does not mean that they do not have like leisure activities at all, but there's a different like mental grid to choose like where they will put like their time, where they will put like their money. And here, as like the study is saying, it's very easy to interpret that people put their money to optimize their financial capital by getting like insurance payments, cuts on the insurance payments, or getting like preferential fees for the nursery school and the cremation society. So now let's take a look at the results of the election. So we can see during that period, even if it's across different type of election, that the percentage of votes between the different groups, so social democrats, Christian socialists, and communists, stay basically very stable during that period. Those like this shift in like 32 is not, I would say, is not exactly remarkable. We could like do statistics, but I don't think like it's a characteristic shift in votes. So social democrats are obviously, left, center left wing. Christian socialists are probably like a little bit like on their right, because of like this idea of like Christian democracy that tends to be in general like more towards the center, and communist is kind of like the far left. And during that period, things stayed generally the same. We had the idea above that there is a discipline in the Social Democratic Party. So that's probably why you have the exact number of people voting for them like across like those like 4 years. And there's a drop of like a very small drop of like Christian socialists, maybe some people that were disillusioned by the takes of their party, but without like checking policies and stuff, it's very hard. It's very hard to say. So now let's see what, and you also see that like the same number of people, generally the people like voted very overwhelmingly during those elections, but because they say that like voting is obligatory for those entitled to vote, so obviously it makes sense that the numbers, the participation number is like very high. So now let's see what is the analysis of like those researchers. So they agreed with the same thing. The general immobility of the voting structure is remarkable, despite the political situation being completely, or social situation being completely different, with people being like all unemployed. They stayed very stable in their split between parties. The few changes are probably less due to ideological shifts than to the immigration of a number of unemployed workers. This might be very true. In this particular like data set, you can see that everything is given in percent instead of absolute nominal numbers. So we don't know like if there are like variation in the absolute number of people voting. The decline from a higher cultural level of political confrontation was accompanied by a rise in more primitive hostilities, motivated by personal malice. This shift could be traced with almost documentary precision. We are thinking particularly of the anonymous denunciations of people who had taken on casual work while drawing unemployment relief. The penalty for this offense was often a prolonged cut off of relief money. Generally, these denunciations were a reaction to a cut in one's own relief money or an act of personal vengeance. Here is an example of such a denunciation. I'm hereby informing the Industrial Commission that Herr NN works as a farmer and draws at the same time unemployment relief. He also has chickens and rabbits, and his wife too draws relief money. Others, when they are making a little on the side, are immediately cut off relief. Those who do not need it get it. The others can starve. The number of such denunciations received by the Industrial Commission during the past 4 years from Marienthal inhabitants is as follows. You can see that we had 9 denunciations before the factory was closing, and after it closed, the number tripled. And more interestingly, most of like the denunciations were found unfounded. I guess like they will explain like this split, but for us it is pretty obvious to understand, right? And they kind of like talked about that just a bit above. These denunciations are a reaction to a cut in one's own relief money or an act of personal vengeance. So there's a very like epidemic and irrational like behavior in like those denunciations. Not irrational, but at least driven by some sense of like vengeance or of anger, discontentness with like the current situation. And it matters not that you're right or wrong in the fact that you're denouncing your neighbor, but you don't want your neighbor that like in your eyes is doing a little bit better to not struggle as much as you do. And I think this is also like a situation we see nowadays with a lot of people focusing and saying that like the problems in their daily life, if we talk about like our current societies with immigration, it's the fault of like the migrants that are coming to take our jobs, instead of focusing on like structural issues at a higher level and the inequalities between like the richer people in our country, the richest even people in our country, and the people that are living like below poverty threshold. So here you have like a very like epidemic reaction to poverty, and if I'm poor, then everyone has to be poor. You are 9 years late to the class. Thank you, Sky, for the 9 years. I hope that you are doing all right. We are still yapping, obviously, about things. My neighbor has been slandering her. I want to denounce them. I am not responsible for any denunciation that you do, but if it makes you happy, then feel free to do so. So yeah, I think this is very interesting because you have like, it kind of like ties with depression, right? And the lack of like solidarity that we have seen between people, because people are not like part of like those like workers groups anymore. They don't feel solidarity with their fellow unemployed neighbor. They feel a sense of jealousy. And I think that like this is what drives like those like denunciations up, but also like in fashions that are slandering or slanderous, because like almost what, like let's do the calculus. Like you have 1 over So 75% of the denunciations were found unfounded, compared like to a third of them before, and like this is a very low number of like denunciations anywhere. Are we still in the midst of reading or in discussion? We're doing both. I'm reading and I'm stopping at like interesting times so we can discuss. We're basically at like half the article, I think. Oh no, we are nearing the end like of the chapter. But then we'll discuss like more about it, especially because like there's another chapter here. I think it ties with like the ideas of like the one we're currently reading, and you'll see like it's very easy to follow. Like the ideas are pretty easy to follow. It's just that like I was also stopping to do methodological analysis. The unfounded denunciations have hardly increased in number. The founded ones have hardly changed. I wouldn't, to be fair, I wouldn't. This analysis feels like a little bit weird because they're taking like the absolute numbers as like a point of comparison. I don't think it's the absolute numbers that matter for founded, unfounded. The absolute numbers only matter in the number of denunciations. What matters is the quality of it. It's the percentage of it, the ratio between founded and unfounded, more than like the fact that like it stayed constant, in my personal opinion. What you could say that like, what you could say maybe is that like people were basically cheating unemployment relief in the same way as before, and that the increase maybe is just like in unfounded things. But I think it's a little bit shaky of an analysis. I wouldn't, because we don't know who did the denunciation, and we would have to take a look at like what was the relationship between like the denunciator and the person being denounced. So at most I would say like that from this table, people were on average like cheating unemployment the same way, but at the same time this is not exactly like, it doesn't fit necessarily the narrative of like other like data that we have like in this analysis of Marienthal, because we see that like I think stealing is also like increasing at that time. So people were doing a little bit more like criminal activities. I would not try to like analyze that in just like in absolute numbers. I think it's like too perilous with like the limited data that we have. So we suspect that social disputes have sunk to a lower level, meaning that, you know, people are just like acting on like base instinct. Whether on the whole the number of hostile acts has increased or decreased is difficult to say, since we do not possess any measure of the state of affairs prior to the period of unemployment, quite apart from the difficulties involved in quantitative statements of this kind. So I think this is a very like interesting like thing that we do in sociology, is that we just don't have data, right? Because as I said, our data is purely rooted in the observation of the world. If we are past a period that we want to investigate, it's just too late. We cannot do any work on that. I think let me try to show you something as well, because I think it can be like interesting. No, this is not this one. This is, I believe, so this is like the script of my video on phishing. And you might remember this particular graphs that we were using that was showing like the percentage of people that were involved in phishing. And this is also split by gender. What is very interesting in this thing is that like we have data starting from, let's say, the early 90s, but we don't have data beforehand. And this is problematic to some extent because I see a drop. I can like infer like a drop at the start of like the bubble economy. But because I do not have like observational data from the period before, it's hard to say how big this drop is or how like the curve was like acting before. Was like the curve like very high and this is like the end like of a very long drop? Or is this like maybe a curve that like had a little bit of a bump before like falling back? And depending on like what it would be, the analysis would be completely different, right? It would like steer the analysis in a very like specific way. We would do like a very like peculiar and specific hypothesis on the situation. But I do not have this data, and I was like searching in multiple compilation of like sources. I was trying to check like official information from the Japanese government if they had things in like white papers and all, and the answer is that like we just do not have data because the leisure white paper that was used to make like this series of observation and this graph started at that time. Before, we just don't have like any data at all. And this is what I mean by we do use like a scientific method to create and verify like hypotheses. But at the same time, the way we are gathering data is very different from natural science in the way that like we cannot replicate the past. We just cannot have access to it anymore. And there are things we just cannot know. We could obviously like you could try to use like other like sources to kind of like complete this particular like data set or have like another a general ID. You could, instead of like taking government numbers, try to check like, you know, the data set of, I don't know, memberships in fishing clubs and try to make like a national like survey to see how things were like evolving. But this is like an imperfect method. Like we are obviously collecting data on participation in fishing, but this is not exactly the same set because participation in fishing clubs is not the same as participation in fishing that you would do on your own, right? Even if you need a permit from the fisheries in Japan, from the fishing associations to fish in like a lot of like rivers. And those like gaps in knowledge, in collectible data, I think, again, it's frustrating to some extent, but it's also very interesting because it forces us to cross and correlate our observation in many different ways. You cannot just use one set of data to draw your analysis. You need like to do a lot of observation. Maybe sometimes they feel disconnected, but it's by having like this broader like picture that you can actually try to like tie things together in a workable like explanation of a situation. And in here, in this particular analysis here, I refuse to talk of the period before because it's just like we don't have like any, you know, workable data to do anything. So my analysis was squarely centered on not this drop of participation that I cannot analyze, but this rise of participation after like the bubble economy. And if you remember, we talked about like the cost of like fishing being like lower than what would be expected, and so on. So this is kind of like the same situation, obviously, in in Marienthal, where because we just do not have like any data on hostilities and criminality beforehand, before like that period, it's just impossible to do any kind of like hypothesis. And because we're scientists, we suspect that like social disputes have sunk to a lower level, but we're not making like a clear-cut explanation because we just lack the means to do so. However that may be, side by side with these acts of personal malice, we found in many critical situations a great solidarity and much willingness to help. Okay, so that's the very like interesting part that is kind of like the nuance of what we said about the collapse of traditional solidarity in worker groups and at the, you know, in the factory where people used to work. A 35-year-old unemployed man wrote in his diary, "Today the woman next door came over and asked whether she could bring the children a bowl of soup. People are good when times are bad." In another case, people who themselves have been unemployed for weeks helped the 3 children of an alcoholic mother keep their heads above water until eventually the national assistance took care of them. So we'll read the analysis just after. It's interesting talking about data in humanities that we can never grasp the fullness of the events, so we have to slice a piece of the facts to analyze, and it kind of creates a dichotomy between how well we can assess a topic and the knowledge that we cannot grasp the whole context in our work. And this is like why discovering like new data can be informative, right? You can do sociology based on obviously like what we do like a lot in sociology is because it's current. We most likely do like a sociology of like current society and not in the past. You will interview people, right? But this is not like the only way to like access mentalities and get like sources. You can like read the diaries. And it's very important to note that every textual sources is always a little bit biased, and you need to keep that into account. But the discovery like of a new set of like documents, for example, could like change the way we are like analyzing a certain event. And I think again this is like both what is making us relatable to like natural science in the way that we're still trying to use like a method that is like baked by data, by like sources. We are applying like a scientific method in the way we are trying to prove and demonstrate things, but at the same time the way we're collecting data is a little bit different. Sociology is the most empirical social science because you are here in the field making like observations instead of just like identifying like broad, you know, currents, movements in society and whatever. But our collection of data is biased, is limited because the entire world is running an experiment and you don't have like control over that. Because again, conversely to natural science, we don't have control groups. When we are coming up with an explanation, a theory, let's say, we are just making the most accurate one against like the data that we have gathered. And obviously, it can be completely wrong. If you have missed like some critical data in your collection by forgetting to ask certain questions, for example, or forgetting to check like certain like sources, then your analysis will be biased and somebody like could come and say that like this is not sound because we have like missed one variable that is very important in here. And I think, for example, if we only do like a study of like unemployment in Marienthal instead, and kind of like forgetting that there are like differences with gender on gender like issues, then your analysis will be like skewed in a weird way. So we have like a scientific method. It's just, yes, we struggle a little bit more with like running and collecting data because of the nature of like the subject that we're trying to analyze. I very much agree with the Weber take that we need to be aware that we are part of the thing we're studying. So whatever we study is going to have scientist bias, but that doesn't need to be a problem given that it's accounted for. Yes, to some extent, or at least as like the researcher, you need to be aware that like there will always be like a bias in your collection of data. Obviously, this is always the case in science, even in natural science, because we are running on like axioms and paradigms. And even if you try to be like objective, you will have like subjective like bias that will creep up in the way you're shaping your experiment. Maybe you're relying on like, what is considered an axiom, but then we'll realize that it's not right. Again, we took the example of like Newtonian physics that works well most of the time until it doesn't. And experimental like experiments nowadays, they do account like for like more modern theories, but again, you can only account for theories when you know about them or you have like an idea about them. And well, obviously this is how like new theories are coming, right? Like discrepancies between the expected result and like reality. But we always have like those bias, and yes, as like scientists, we need to be aware of like those bias and apply a sort of like degree of like uncertainty to account for them. Also, when someone else studies the same topic, they will bring their own repertoire to the issue. And then we engage on Gadamer's spirals of hermeneutics, and the knowledge has the potential to deepen. Exactly. I think that's why like it's especially important nowadays in science in general, not just like social science, but like science in general, to have like this disciplinary like approach by like bringing people from like different like fields to work on the same problem. I think I talked at the beginning about the difference between social psychology and sociology. Again, we take like a look at the same thing, right? In Marienthal, we would take a look at like, again, the title of like this stream, how does unemployment affect well-being? But a social psychologist will have like a different like answer than a sociologist. Not necessarily like widely different, but a different approach that can blend with each other. And again, we remember that like Marie Yahoda, one of the contributors of like this analysis, was a psychologist first. And she blended with like Lazarsfeld, who was in mathematics, and Teisel, that was like on state economy studies. Those different perspectives, I think, are kind of like obvious in this particular analysis of Marienthal, and they shape what at the time they called like sociography, which is like a short term for like social geography. But like this is like sociology nowadays. It's like we are taking things from history, from psychology and stuff. We do agree that like people are interacting with each other, and that like this interaction will influence both sides of like the relationship. That's what symbolic interactionism is, meaning that like the group is influencing the individual, but the individual is influencing groups. Because like for like the interactionist, basically you put labels on yourself and on the others, and it's not exactly you versus the other individual. It's your labels against like the labels that you have like put on someone else. So poor versus rich, proletarian versus bourgeois, those things. And there's a lot of nuance, there's a lot of different disciplines that come up to explain like events, and we have to, in French we say we have to burn all wood. Like, if you have like tools in your toolbox, why not use them, right? And in a certain way, that's what they were doing in Marienthal by doing both like interviews, measurements, like we talked about like the idleness and kind of like the depression of people that were not like, they didn't want to do like activities like tending the gardens, tending the park, or things like this. There's a very interesting like thing they are doing at some point in the study. They're actually measuring the speed of walking of people, and they have found that like men walked way slower than like women in Marienthal because they were unemployed and also they had nothing to do. Whereas women still had to take care of like the home, the children, and so on, and they had like somewhere to go. So that's why they walked faster, and they stopped also less to look around them on their way to, you know, wherever they wanted to go. They did also do like a measure of like the gait, to show again that like women felt like more active than like men that were unemployed. And those like different like observation data that come like from, you know, different fields almost, they try to explain like one phenomenon, what we call like a social phenomenon. And you have like in sociology this idea of like a total social phenomenon, meaning that it's something that will ooze in all matters of daily life. Unemployment is not just the fact that you don't have to work, it also shows in the way you eat, in the way you dress, in the way you move, in the way you think, in all the activities of your life. And because this is a total social phenomenon, then we can look at like everything around us to inform like those behaviors. What becomes like very difficult, obviously, is to identify multiple variables. Like we try to assess unemployment, but of course, like you don't know if there are like other things at play in here, if gender is at play, if you know, the previous financial means are also at play, race can be also at play. What works well in this study of Marienthal is that because the entire village was working beforehand in the factory, and everybody basically went into unemployment, you have a pretty like homogeneous field group that you can study, and you're in a certain way, not completely, but in a certain way, you are like nullifying a lot of like other variables to really focus on like unemployment. In a society where your worth is measured by your productivity, the behavior of someone who's unemployed is going to be affected holistically. Yes, exactly. And that's what we saw like in the previous pages. We saw that like people they're reading less, they are participating less in political meetings, and they feel like more depressed about things. They don't have the means, the envy, the desire, or the desire to go and, you know, to Vienna or to buy things, both because their financial means have been decreased, but also because they are depressed. Don't worry. I'm happy to do like kind of like a recap of what we said. But the central point of like this analysis was really much that like as much as like those people had like a lot of free time due to unemployment, they felt like resigned and even like apathic in some cases, to the point they were not doing like any activities, even though they could have. And I think this is like a very interesting case and very interesting observation, because that's what we find also nowadays in our current society, and we have seen that like a lot. If you take, for example, the hikikomori situation in Japan, so those like young people that are staying at home and not like leaving their apartment to do anything, those shut-in people, you see that like this is also this phenomenon also becomes like a real problem because of the last decades, which is like a period where people were struggling to find some work. Work impose a schedule on people, and more often than not, it is like a productive thing to foster like social relationship, because you go somewhere and you meet people there, you go outside, you interact with people outside. And the lack of like those essential solidarities will break down like someone's psyche to the point where they feel like disconnected from society, what we call anomie in sociology. And hikikomori in Japan were really much like an example of that. And this is the case in like, most societies in general, where you don't have like enough benefits or measures that are done like for unemployed or young people that don't go to school or whatever. Is if you don't give like people a space to be, then they will struggle and tend like to not interact with society again. And this is what you find like in Marienthal in this study, like to some extent, people don't find like the drive to do things, because why would you? Why would you? Okay, so very interesting like thing in here. Various officials who have known Marienthal for a longer period than we believe that the balance of public spirited and anti-social behavior has on the whole remained unchanged. This fits in with our general impression. The anti-social impulses that must accompany any existence on the brink of collapse do not come to the surface because of a growing lassitude. As excitement and fatigue cancel each other out, the overall level of solidarity in the community appears unchanged. In chapter 7, we'll observe the changes that occurred within the family. So, like, a very interesting thing that they are saying here is that, yes, there is a breakdown of solidarity, but also that doesn't mean that people are antisocial necessarily. It's just that the analysis isn't quantitative in that regard, but more quantitative. And we won't like talk about like chapter 7 necessarily much, because we don't have time for this today. But the idea is that at home, yes, the level of commitment will change a little bit. So within the household, within the family, and this is more of like a qualitative difference than a quantitative difference. The antisocial and public spirited aspect. So that's basically like chapter 5, and they go into like more detail in like the next chapters. There are like a few pictures, but I don't think they can be like very useful to examine on their own. So I just want to take a look at the beginning of chapter 7, and we won't read anything, but like, so that's what I told you about, like these stops, like people were doing. You can see that like on their way to, somewhere, men were doing like far more stops than women, because they don't have like any clear destination in mind. So they had the time also to stop. And you can see also that in general, like men walk slower than women, again, because of the idleness. I don't want to talk too much about that. What is very interesting to me is this. So this is the schedule of a 33-year-old unemployed man for a single day. And we'll compare that to like the schedule of someone working. So 6 to 7 getting up, 7 to 8 wake the boys because they have to go to school. 8 to 9, when they have gone, I go down to the shed to get wood and water. 9 to 10, when I get back up to the house, my wife always asks me what she ought to cook. To avoid the question, I go off into the field. 10 to 11, in the meantime, midday comes around. 11 to 12, empty. 12 to 1, we eat at 1 o'clock. The children don't come home from school until then. 1 to 2, after the meal, I take a look at the newspapers. 2 to 3, go out. 3 to 4, go to Triers, the shopkeepers. 4 to 5, watch trees being cut down in the park. A pity about the park. 5 to 6, go home. 6 to 7, it's time for the evening meal, noodles and semolina pudding. 7 to 8, go to bed. Compare this with a timesheet drawn by a Viennese metal worker still employed. 6 to 7, get up, washed, breakfast. 7 to 8, streetcar to the factory, read newspaper, start work at 7:30. 4 hours of factory. 12 to 1, half an hour's lunch break, stay at work and eat a packed lunch. 3 more hours of factory. 4 to 5, take the streetcar home, finish reading the paper, wash, tea. 5 to 6, lie down on sofa, talk to my wife about various things. 6 to 7, fetch the children from the playground. 7 to 8, evening meal. 8 to 9, political party meeting. 9 to 10, empty. Then go home, go to bed. And we'll read that because I completely agree with this analysis and I have nothing to add. For an unemployed man, the day lasts 13 and a half hours. For a worker, 17 hours. You can see they go to bed like far later than the unemployed one. The few leisure hours the employed worker enjoys after his 8-hour shift are carefully disposed of and incomparably richer and more active than the many hours forced upon the man out of work. Walking the children certainly does not take up a whole hour. Trier's shop, where he spent 1 hour, is only 3 minutes from where this man lives, and the distance from the park to his home, which he covers in the hour between 5 and 6, is about 300 yards. What happens in the intervals? Every timesheet tells the same story. What happens is idleness. At home, stood on the corner outside the house. Very empty, right? The unemployed worker can only recall a few events. Between the 3 reference points of getting up, eating, and going to bed lie intervals of inactivity hard to describe for an observer and apparently also difficult to describe for the man himself. He merely knows that in the meantime, midday comes around. So, this meantime is very interesting. This is what we found in here, right? In the meantime, midday comes around. It's not even 12. It's 1 hour before. It's for 1 hour, you're just looking at things. To the point that there was a documentary made on this sociological book called, let me bring that to you. Heinz Weiler via des Mittag. So this is let me show you. So this is this particular thing. We won't watch it, but if I don't think there are subtitles anywhere. I'm kind of like, sorry, you need to know German like to watch this. But this is like a sort of like, you know, drama film that was made upon this. Yahoda was not completely, you know, in agreement in the fact that like it's a little bit like emotional for no reason at some points. But you have like this scene in here where they talk about like, let me, that maybe I can like show.
Geben die meisten arbeitslos an.
He will like basically talk about like, you know, literally read like the schedule that we have seen.
Sie gleiten ab aus einer geregelten Existenz ins Leere.
6 bis 7 Uhr stehe ich auf. 8 bis 10 Uhr gehe ich vors Haus. 10 bis 11 Uhr an der Ecke des Hauses gestanden. 11 bis 12 Uhr, einstweilen wird es Mittag. 12 bis 13 Uhr haben wir gegessen. 14 bis 16 Uhr Spaziergang zur Bahn. 16 bis 17 Uhr nach Hause gegangen.
You have this sense of idleness, of like a terrible idleness to the point where existence doesn't make sense anymore. And I think this is like the very interesting thing that we draw from like this analysis. Obviously, there is like some psychology into it. Like you can see like the psyche of like men at that time being shifted by like unemployment, but like on a sociological basis, you also understand how like unemployment is affecting like the group of people. They just don't see time in the same way, and they don't like engage with like the community in the same way as before. They also like lead a meaningless existence. They don't find meaning in leisure, in free time. And to relate that to like a higher ideas, again, this is, and I really like insist on that because I think that's one of the critical point of like this analysis is that unemployment is not making a revolutionary subject. It is making resigned individuals. People that try to still live, you know, day by day. They still try to maintain the household, to keep everything like afloat, but they don't have like any hope in the future. They don't believe in revolts and stuff. And this has been like keenly analyzed. Let me show you other text. It has been keenly analyzed by like other people. I was talking a little bit before about a movement of like unemployed people in France in 98, where they were like occupying the buildings of ACEDIC, so the main unemployment benefit institution, basically. And they won. This is very much like a miracle. You can see like a social miracle. That's how it was called back then, like in France. Because most studies at that time agreed that with the observation of like Marienthal that unemployment is just like breaking political solidarity and the drive of people to engage in like political like discussions and movements. And so when we had like this movement in the winter 97, the question was, what happened in there? What was so special in there that the movement was successful? And so people, and here like Pierru and Maurer, did some study on this like unemployed movement in France. And they say that. So you have like several like people like engaged in like this movement. Let's not talk too much about it. But among them, you have former unionized workers whose motivation for engagement is rooted in militant tradition. So we talked about like party discipline, and this is kind of like what we find in here. Unemployed and without qualifications, having worked for many years in the same company, they hold a highly valued view of work, primarily as a site of sociabilities. Again, you go to work and you see people. For those people, work was like the key place to engage with other persons. And if you remember, that's what we saw at the beginning. With people saying here, life was better at the factory, nanana. You have a great many challenges, and when work is over, you're free and can live up a little. At a woman, I like that sort of life. I enjoyed working and wasn't stuck in one place all the time. You see people, you do different things, and that's important. So the loss of employment is therefore particularly painful, and at first glance, one might see a resurgence of the total unemployment model, highlighted by Dominique Schnapper in L'épreuve du chômage. So the trial of unemployment, I think, I can't remember the date exactly. I think it's, if my memory is not failing me, this should be like 1981, something like this. But at least in the 90s. So Dominique Schnapper, one of our most important like French sociologists when it comes to question of like unemployment. And this like total unemployment model is kind of like what we have been saying about like Marienthal, how like unemployment will break down like people in general. And so characterized by a prevalence of a sense of humiliation and uselessness, what we have seen in Marienthal, right? However, in this situation in France in 97, 3 elements counteract this phenomenon. First, a particularly valued experience in trade union activism that is transitively reinvested into the experience of unemployment. You have been striking, you know how to strike when you're at work, and so you continue to be like an activist when you're unemployed. Second, a persistence of a value system strongly structured around notions of solidarity and working class, allowing for the conception of mobilizing framework of injustice. You keep being around people that believe in working class solidarity. So even if you're unemployed, you still feel a connection to employed people that are struggling because their contracts are very unstable. You keep like getting engaged in those like leftist conversations. And third, a preservation of strong social because of the neighborhood and of family ties, wife and children, that ensure a solid identity as a family man, capable of offsetting any potential effects of narcissistic devaluation resulting from job loss. Yes, you are like unemployed, but you are still seen as like the father of the household, and you still like keep yourself together basically. And because of this, the foundation of this unemployed workers' mobilization remains a desire to express their solidarity with others in the same position. A solidarity they place on both a political and human level, and which led them to join unemployed organizations prior to the movement of winter 1987. So in here, basically, what it's saying is that, like, yes, unemployment is breaking down like traditional solidarity at work, but those people here were still like in solidarity networks, being like organizations, unions, whatever. And that's because they were able to sustain those links, those ties of like solidarity, that they felt compelled into action. Two types of personal rewards are explicitly derived from activism here. On one hand, benefits in terms of identity validation. You're still a leftist, you're still part of the working class, you're still with your friends, so you're still part of the group. And on the other hand, benefits in terms of investing spaces and times that serve as alternatives to professional spaces and times. So yes, you cannot go to work to meet other people, but you can meet them in other places, and that works like on a very group basis. And that's the difference between Marienthal and this situation in France at that time. Is that like the organizations, the unions and stuff did enough, had like a solid enough like skeleton to keep people together, instead of like seeing like a decline in participation. And obviously nowadays, like, situation is a bit more complicated, because in France and in most of the Western world, if you check like data, we see like a big drop in unionization of people, compared like to the heights of like, you know, the 60s, 70s, even like 80s to some extent. And because like unions do not like fulfill anymore their role of solidarity between people, and especially among like the younger generations are more at risk of anomie and disconnect with society, because they don't have like those spaces to hang out. Obviously, in our current societies, internet serves to some extent as like a stopgap to that situation. We see a lot of people, and again, like hikikomori, people like using like social media, internet, to like find solidarity online and hang out with people online. But this like solidarity online is not as, you know, fulfilling to some extent as like solidarity like offline, because it doesn't change necessarily the material capital that you have. You don't have like people able to help you like in real life if you need to, like if you need money, if you need like material solidarity. People online can only do so much. And I think this is like the big difference to some extent between like charity online, where it's very impersonal, and charity like offline, where you have like the collective that has like more weight and can like push things more actively. And so we see how much like solidarity is important to keep like people within like the community, within the group. So that's basically like what is very interesting to me in this like analysis of like Marienthal, and why it's like such a classic of like sociology. Because in the 30s, in the early 30s, like the method was not exactly like set in stone yet. Empirical data, I think, is it's very much like something that comes from the American school, to be fair. American people, American sociologists, they really love interviews, on-field like examinations and stuff, and I think it's great. In Europe, we tend to have like a more a higher level of sociologists, not higher in the sense of like they are better than Americans, but we love theory like a little bit more. And this leads to like different traditions in our practice of like of sociology. But this like study of Marienthal back then kind of like highlighted the importance, the necessity of like having a method that spans many different like sources, many different interviews, experiments, or like observation of like a community. You have interviews with people, so asking questions. They were reading like their diaries. They would like check subscriptions for magazines, journals, newspapers, the attendance in library, attendance in organizations, in political groups and stuff. Again, checking how people walked in the street, their behavior. They checked also what they were eating, the budget allocated to food, allocated to clothes, allocated to leisure. And I think it's because of like this very wide array of observation that they were able to draw like such an analysis of Marienthal. It's not perfect. The methodology of like the Marienthal study is not perfect, and it has been like already talked by Lazarfeld himself. So there is like we know that like for Lazarfeld, this is like the book, the study that he liked the least, because for him the methodology was a little bit shaky. He felt like he was missing some very like critical data. He did not like thought about like observing certain things, and he believed that like his figures were sometimes a little bit blurry, like there was like a lack of accuracy and precision in his observations. And I think like one other problem with the Marienthal like study that was like seen by like Pierre Bourdieu, so one of our like foremost sociologists in France, was this one. So this is the foreword of like the French edition to Marienthal. He's saying things. So I would be inclined to think, on the contrary, that the most real weakness of this work lay less, as he believed, in the imperfection and imprecision of the measurements than in the inability to conceive of science as anything other than a simple recollection, recording, and measurement of everything and nothing. So in a very like empirical way. Just, I need to observe, and what I will observe is like kind of like the truth, right? We won't go into like the philosophical like consideration and epistemological like consideration of Bourdieu because it is very complicated. He was a very like complicated intellectual. But I'm thinking, for example, of all the effects that may have been exerted on the survey relationship and on the very observation of practice by the fact that the investigators had to present themselves as social workers to approach their subject, thereby risking the provocation of what appears to be the dominated, instructed by experience as the obligatory counterpart of any assistance or charitable action. So what he says basically here is that like because the sociologists were presenting themselves as like social workers or whatever, that twisted their relationship with the people that they were interviewing. And maybe those people felt that they had to appear in a certain way to gain like the charity of like those quote unquote social workers, to gain like benefits and to change the situation of Marienthal. And Bourdieu says, of course, there's nothing wrong in trying, to change the life of people, again, because this was a politically, engaged work. It tried to, change things for people in Marienthal and in Austria in general, unemployed people. And I don't believe, so Bourdieu doesn't believe that there could exist, whatever one does, a pure survey relationship from which any effect of imposition, even domination, is absent. That's the thing. While in natural science you can have like a pseudo, objective like observation of an experiment, like data doesn't lie. Like you measure like this tension in the current, in the electrical current, it is here, it is objective. In sociology, because we're observing things, and especially when we're asking questions, we are intruding on people's life, and they will, whether we like it or not, whether it's voluntary or not, they will change like their answer. They will behave in a way that is not completely natural. And to forget that the survey itself is a social relationship tends to structure all interaction. Yeah, basically that. It inevitably tends to structure all interactions. If you ask people a question, they will tend to answer like in a way that is a little bit biased, because you have like hinted at like some answers that you want to listen to. If you ask how Marienthal was before, and how if it was better before, you are like going with like the presupposition that it was better before, and people will go and take like your invitation to talk about it like in a slightly more positive fashion. Even if they do believe so, it will be still tainted by the question. And I think that's like the critical part of sociology, is that like, as we say, there is like a bias in our observation, and we always need to account for it. And that's why you need some like cross references. You need to use different type of like sources, different type of like observations, to come to like a reasonable and an acceptable like hypothesis that feels like rooted in a broader reality. And I think like Bourdieu is very harsh for like this particular with this particular work, because he says that, but he's also like guilty of doing the exact same thing in his own like work. But it is what it is. Like Bourdieu is again very complicated, like intellectual. On the bias of being surveyed, yeah. It's interesting to see how those schools shape analysis on the same topic. I remember during criminology classes, the analytical model more widely adopted in research on topic was from the Chicago School. I wonder what other takes there are based on different frameworks. Well, there is. To be fair, like I think that like nowadays we have reached a point where all those theories have basically blended together. Like we have seen the good and the bad of like every type of schools, and you would be, to be fair, in my opinion, nowadays hard pressed to find someone that has like, oh, I'm from this school and nothing else. I don't know if you know about like about structural functionalism. To make things like very simple, this is like an almost like biological approach to sociology. You have structures that are kind of like organs that are interacting with each other's. So sometimes it like jumps to conclusions in like a very like strange way. And I don't even know if like someone nowadays like is a functionalist. I don't even think that, because we have seen like all the limits that like functionalism has today. I'm not saying that you need like to discard like everything from it. I think there was still like very interesting like things, especially like on the sociology of like law. But most of like what it like tries to do, we have like better tools nowadays to use them to explain like certain like phenomenons. So we have basically like taken out all that is good like from functionalism to use it like in our more modern like methods. But nobody is saying that like, you know, we are discarding, like we are against like functionalism necessarily. The same way like you can grow up like as a Marxist with like a Marxist way of like thinking, and Marxists, they will say that, this is like what is driving sociology for Marxists is like conflict theory. Everything is like about conflict between like two different groups, two different set of values. And that's how like interaction, how meaning is like creating from it, how like behavior can be explained. But this like conflict theory is in fact like very close to what we do with like symbolic interactionism, which is like, again, the interaction between the group and the individual, and like people kind of like influencing like each other, both like at an individual and a group level, and creating new meaning for this. So you have like those like schools, and we teach them like, during your first like classes of like sociology, we teach about like schools of like sociology, but in our like more current like research, things are obviously blended. Like you will take the good things from like every little groups. Like I'm both a Marxist and like an interactionist, but also like I love description more than like big theories. We just like take what works to make our, soup. What is important at the end is like believing in the scientific method. And believing in like the nuance of our observation, that like our empiric like observations, they are flawed, and we need like tools to counteract like those like natural flaws, and to still try to build like coherent theories from those observations, and being like open to the fact that they can change with like more empirical data and stuff. So I think like schools will obviously like change the way you're looking at things, but most likely nowadays, if you have like people that are like very much, saying that they are from one school and they hate the others, those are very like old-fashioned people that are not necessarily like in touch with what we do nowadays, because we tend to blend like a lot of things. From my empirical experience, law tend to be pretty isolated philosophically and sociologically, and has a more technical reproductive focus, at least here in Brazil. I will say I feel like it's the same thing in like at least Europe, but again, I'm not exactly like, I haven't done like law at all. I haven't had like class of law. So I don't want to comment on that. But the fact that maybe, I never had like classes on that says something about like how isolated to some extent it is from the rest of like the other like fields. Obviously you do sociology, you do criminology in like law, and I think it's like very important. But as like someone in social science, I was never like offered a transversal elective class in law, because it wasn't seen really much as like something, I don't know. I'm interested in to see how more modern sociological concepts could affect our view here. I think our modern like more than like necessarily like a toolbox, I would say this is like axioms that are very like important. Obviously, if you're a Marxist, you believe that everything is like class-based, and you will miss some identity like things a little bit, especially if it's not like class identities. So you have like a rise of, for example, like feminist sociology that may or may not have like Marxist roots, and that will like inform like the way women are behaving. And I think more than like a concept that will radically change the way you're looking at things, it's more that like current research and current interest in research have highlighted like interesting points that we need to keep in mind. I think like, so I did like a research on for my research on rivers. I studied like and we talked about that communities that were relocated because of dam construction, right? You could look at the community like in general, but I think like a close studies of like gender is very interesting. because you see that like women have like different like relationship towards like or behaviors in face of like these imminent relocations. You had like some women that started to look for like, and especially women that did not come like from those villages, that were seeking to marry into local families because they knew they could get some money, some compensation money, if they were part of like, if they were married to, you know, a villager that was going to be relocated. And you had like those women that would come like in the village like a few years before like its basically destruction, and that had different like behaviors compared to women that lived there like for their entire life. And feminist studies, I think, kind of like highlighted both like the difference of behaviors, but also like how those different behaviors kind of sometimes meld together when like those like different women would like you know, join each other in women's group in the village, and choose like, and you know, make decision about like the village, maybe, you know, talk about leisure and stuff like this. And you have like this very like interactional position. Well, you can, let's say you can like study like those behaviors through an interactionist lens and also like a feminist lens, and you will have like conclusions that are maybe a bit different than like if you had like a purely like Marxist approach that would like only focus on, you know, blending all those women together in like a class of like women, and like some nuance like here would disappear a little bit. I'm a Marxist myself. Still, I need to read more. I think we always like, you know, that's why I don't believe like in schools necessarily, because we are very much like informed by the readings that we have done, right? I did sociology, obviously, but like I read a lot because I was more like into history since like, you know, I was young. I read like a lot of anthropologists. And I think this had like a big influence like on me. I've read like a lot of Philippe Descola, who talked about like different things, and you can see here, I think, like beyond culture and nature, and kind of like he talked also like about the different type of like societies and their relationship like to religion and stuff. But like this was like an author that I read like very young, and he has like an absurd like influence on me. So I grew up like thinking as a structuralist because of like anthropology, you can see here, and post-structuralist, you know, reading like Levi-Strauss and all. But then, you know, you get into history, you get into sociology, you get into literature, you understand that things are like a little bit more flexible. I have like also key authors that like I really like and that have a more like descriptive approach, and my view of things change a little bit. So if we talk about, for example, Marx, I think it's like super nice and super important to read Marx, because I can't stress enough how reading like The Capital is such like an enlightening like reading. You will like learn so much from it, and so much like methodology, and then you can like choose whatever you want to do with that. Like it doesn't make you like a Marxist to read like Marx, and like Marxism as like a school of thoughts. It's also like the descendant of like Marx, right? And also like a way people taught Marx in schools and universities in like the 60s, 70s, 80s. And again, like I have like a lot of Marx in me because I was reading like a lot of like thinkers, especially in feminism, that were inspired by Marx. But then you need to go beyond. You need like to read like other people that are not like from a Marxist school necessarily, or kind of like descendant that strayed a little bit away from Marx, and you will see like so much more and blend that in like your personal approach. I'm just now learning about structuralism in linguistics. It's such like an interesting like topic. I think linguistics like is kind of like a very like interesting thing because it has like this almost like scientific like feel to it, like, you know, mathematic feel to it, and you can like approach like linguistics in like such a different way. You have people that will approach linguistics in a very like mathematical, logical way, you know, generative grammar and stuff like this. And then you have like people that are like, this is like bullshit because like linguistics is also like rooted in like sociology and societies. And then it's about like, how do you blend the two together? And we have the same thing about like, as in sociology and anthropology of like, how can our discipline be like both empiric and rational? And I think it's a very open question. And there's no like easy answer. It's, you know, we practice every day and we use like new tools, new approach, and we study new fields, new object of studies every day. Did you read it translated or the original? I read it like translated twice in two different like French translations, but as a difficult, obviously, like book, and because like we are missing a lot of like the very like poetic play that like Marx is doing. Like you have a lot of like very, you know, invented words by Marx. Or, you know, he's blending like words together like in an interesting way. I think it's always great to read like Marx with like commentaries or with a lecture, someone like to guide you through your reading like of Marx. My first time was when I was really young. I was like 16 or maybe even, no, I was like 15 when I started reading Marx for the first time. I did understand obviously what it was about, but it was hard to really derive, you know, higher ideas from it. I did read it again when I was 18, I think, and that was like with like a commentary. And I'm basically like right now I'm reading it like again slowly when I have time, and I'm reading like I'm watching like a lecture. At the same time, I'm reading like notes because we had like a new translation that was published in France. It's very interesting. It's very interesting to see like how, you know, reading the same text again and again, like you have like different ideas that it is creeping up. We do or we do not agree with Marx, but it's a very provocative like reading, and especially when like the translation is changing a little bit, so you can see how it gives like a new perspective, is what I mean. But yeah, I think that that's why like Marienthal is such like a critical study, to go back like to the initial like book. I don't know why like the PDF is like broken, but it's a study from like the 30s, right? So in many ways it's like outdated. The methodology a little bit questionable, even if there was like still like a lot of very good things. I think what is very interesting and why it is a classic today, to the extent that like, you know, it is like taken at like as an example in like the very first classes of like sociology, and especially of like unemployment sociology studies, is that it is very relatable. You can really see through like all those observations like a cut of like this village, a transversal cut of this village, and a lot of like, it's very vivid, which is like kind of like the point of like interesting like studies for me. Like obviously you can have like very, you know, high level abstract like studies. You have like 2x2x2 variable studies that are very hard to approach, especially when it comes to sociology of like political actors, sociology of state, and all the things. But I think also like on more like general like topics, more relatable topics like work, unemployment. Like we're also talking about like groups and people, and sometimes it's nice to have like very approachable, descriptive like studies of things. There's like another book. I don't know if it has been translated. Kind of like one of the most important books in my opinion in working class sociology. It's Le Monde Privé des Ouvriers, so the private world of workers. That is studying like working class societies in the north of France. And this is really much like a study that was here. You can read it here. It's so Schwartz, the researchers, was really like he lived there and he wanted to make like an urban ethnography survey of like people here. So he went into like apartments and stuff. He studied like the way people lived in the city, and he showed like how work in like the mines and in factories had been shaping like the life of people, even years after they have left they have left their work. Maybe they are like retiring or whatever, but for him this was really like shaping the study of like the domestic world of people that we tend to associate with like the public image of like working in a factory. And I love like this book so much because it's so relatable. It feels so relatable. It's people talking about how they love. How do you experience love as like a worker working in a factory? How do you find time for your relationship with your wife, with your husband? How do you behave with your children? What's the role here of the mother in like the household, in a working class household? What type of like places those people go to? How are they shaping their daily life? And because those are like very like everyday life observation, I think it's they're very relatable. And I think like that's what is also important about like sociology is like we talk about people, right? And I personally believe that like there is some amount of like, as much as we have like a scientific method, there's also like an empathy in sociology, in the way we need to approach sociology, approach society. It's like especially when we are talking about like groups that are oppressed, dominated by capitalism and so on, there's a care that like you have in the way you're asking your questions, even if you try to be objective. You will like relate to people through interviews and things, and like I've conducted surveys before, and it's like asking questions about their mentality, the mindset of people. It's you will like get into their heads like very like easily, and it's so hard not to empathize, not to feel like what they're feeling, especially when they're talking about difficult things. And maybe sometimes that's why like people think that like sociology is not a real science, right? Because we are driven by interpretation and like we have no methods. We just like ask questions and then we just interpret that like as we want. no, there is like a scientific method. We try to be as objective as we can. To use like tools in like an objective manner, even if we know that like there's a part of like subjectivity that will never be able to remove because of like the way we're conducting interviews and surveys and how like our questions are shaping like the answers. But we try our best, and at the end, it's like trying to understand like a society, right? Trying to understand people, trying to understand like how things are working. You cannot, I believe, as a sociologist, you cannot like remove like a part of yourself, of humanity in like your analysis. It's the same thing in ethnography, right? Like where you're in immersion in like a society of like a group, a community, and you have like people that are very like open to you. They are accepting you in their group. They are making you part of this group, even like as a stranger. You will be part of like this little family for a while, and you will experience their hardships and their joys and stuff like this. And I think good studies, and perhaps the most remarkable ones, are the ones where you have this drive and this ambition of really being like a clear scientific work grounded in observation, on educated hypothesis, and trying to be as serious as you can, but also by being relatable to others. And especially about like, those like big monographies that are doing analysis like over, 200, 300, 400 like pages. You also tell a story in some ways. And if you read Marienthal, this is like a very like relatable analysis. Obviously, we have only read like a part of it today, but Marie Yahoda is the one like that was writing the entire thing herself. Like the entire quality, literary quality of like the book is her success and hers alone. And it's hard not to empathize with like people in Marienthal through like the interviews, the quotes from the interviews, and the way like the story like is shaped, even if it has like this like formal scientific like writing. Sociology, even if we talk about like groups, and I think especially like in interactivist sociology, where we believe that the individual has an influence on the group, we should not like, at least it's my belief, we should not like forget that we're talking about like individuals. Maybe some people will disagree with me on that, and I'm completely open to like disagreement on like epistemological like issues such as those. But yeah, I really believe that like we can keep everything in mind. We can keep like society as a whole, the group in mind, macro like phenomenons, but also like give back to people their margin of choice. Like it's not because there is like a macro phenomenon that is compelling people to behave that way on average, that everyone is behaving that way. We need to let people do things also that sometimes are going against our observations and theories, because they always have like a margin of freedom. And accepting that, I think it's also like accepting, to some extent, the limitations of like sociology. It's not removing like any scientificness from it, in my opinion. It's acknowledging that like what we're studying is like very complex. Like the world is like very complex, and having a sociological mind, it's looking at the world around you with like the goal of understanding more of it, and then you go like in the street, you see people behaving that way, and sometimes it just makes sense because it's it ties with like theories that you have read and stuff. sometimes it doesn't, but like it makes you more understanding of like things. Sociology is a tool to understand the world, not prescribe it exactly. Like that's why I love descriptive like sociology, because who are we to try to, write a big theory of the world around us? There's always like local contexts, personal context that, escape our approach. And of course, the goal of sociology is like to give like some sort of like broad observations about our society. And I'm happy to do so, We talked a lot about the lost decades and how like in average it would lead young people to behave like in a certain way on average because of, the disconnect with like the world around them. But again, you have like people that are defying like those observations. Like in Marienthal, you had approximately like 10% of people that were still like, very involved in like political like groups that had like hopes for the future, that were trying to change things and stuff like this. We always speak in average. And I think that's how we keep ourselves scientific. It's by accepting that like our descriptions are not predictions or prescriptions. It's a guideline to understand like the world around us. It's one of my main gripes with law. It's supposed to help us navigate our contradictions, not to be a seer. I think it's the thing, right? And especially like with law as understood like as something that is meant to punish people. Like, of course, we can use like justice as like a punishing tool, but like the moment you see like law as a tool for reparation and a guideline for like a more just society, and you still like give people like a margin of like humanity to like interpret law like in a fashion that makes us human. I think yes, law has like a lot of merits, but that's like the difference between like the spirit of the law and the letter of the law, right? Like you want to follow the spirit of the law, but unfortunately, many people and many like judicial like institutions around the world do not. And the question is like, how do we handle that? And I think like as a jurist, for example, like that like an associate or whatever, that's kind of like your work to like to learn about the law and also like see how it can be changed. And I think it's why like all the how do I say that? Like law is like a collective construction, right? You have different groups that are coming together, different like you have the lawmakers, but you have also like associations, organizations that are like coming to see and to check like if there are shortcomings, that are doing some activism and have revendications to change like some parts of it, add new things, remove other things. If we treat law as like something like alive and something that is supposed to reflect our understanding of society and what justice, what equality means for us, then I think law is like a formidable tool. But when law is like weaponized for like certain groups instead of like the greater good, yes, that's how we have problems. And we see it right now, especially if we take like the United States as like an example, with like the Supreme Court kind of like weaponizing like the law and making like very like clear-cut statements that have like far-reaching effects, not just in America but also the rest of the world. We see like kind of like the limit, maybe not of the law, but the fragility of like the law in face of like political institutions that today are meant to not meant, but that are able like to use it in a very like utilitarian way. I think like justice, law, rules, those are like very fragile concepts, and if we really believe like in democracy, if we really believe like in equality, justice, then it means like caring as for like those like things as much as we should. We do not like use a law as a weapon, as you said, right? Like or a seer, but like I think we should use law as like a walking cane. It helps us like go through things, but sometimes because you grow up, right? Like you can imagine someone like a child walking with like a walking cane or whatever, but it becomes like too small as like the child is growing up, and then you need to change like this cane like for another one that fits like how you walk. And I think it's the same thing with like sociology and stuff. It's like we have theories, but these theories, I believe, help us like understand more about the world around us. And sometimes like they're outdated, and we need to update them. We need to go beyond. This is the same thing with applied like philosophy and stuff like this. I think, you know, for example, like Judith Butler's work around gender did like a lot to help us like understand our world and queer identities better. And we are like building upon that. And we should not like be, I think, afraid of saying that like our work is scientific, but also like meant to better our society by understanding it more precisely. You need like a clear image of like what works and what doesn't work in a society to be able to change it. And that's like the point of like science. As much as like, you know, goodwill is great to, you know, change things around, without theory, without observational data, then it's blind. You can have like goodwill, but you can also be blind, and because of that your actions will be useless because they are not directed at like the true causes of the issues that we have nowadays. And I think like on the topic of like unemployment, this sort of like anomaly that has been like identified is very interesting because it prompted like people to do a lot of work against unemployment. And I finish on that like for Marienthal today, is that there has been like because the Arbeitslosen von Marienthal is such like a big expression nowadays in Austria. Well, there's a reason why Austria for a very long time, I don't know lately, but for a very long time had one of the lowest like unemployment rates in Europe, because they were like actively like fighting it, knowing what consequences would follow by having like very high unemployment. And that's rooted in like a scientific work. In Marienthal, people were like studying like things like properly and so on. There were like flaws in the studies that would warrant like, you know, another look or whatever. But who doesn't make mistakes in science anyway? I think the important thing is like to acknowledge our failings and trying to do better, both as researchers that are using like these scientific methods. No matter what like scientific method it is, because again, we have like different approach to things. But we can be that, and also we can be like human beings that are capable of like having an opinion on the world around us and also fighting for like a better world. And I really don't believe that like those two things like are necessarily and you know opposed. But again, that's my personal position on like science and also like public engagement, public like the duty that we have like as citizens and also like a member of like this society and also like members of the scientific community. Like it would be easy, you know, to stay quiet about like certain like things around us, but I don't think that like it's warranted most of the time. Okay, but that's basically it. So that was my introduction to like sociology through like this book of like Marienthal that was published in the early 30s. There is, again, I will say, this documentary that you might watch. I know that like it's a very big documentary that is used in the first like classes of sociology in Germany and Austria. Again, it's a little bit like emotion laden, I guess, but it's also like a very wonderful like way to approach the topic, especially as like you see like those like, you know, actors playing the researchers kind of like going through their research and going through like the scientific method to study like this issue of like unemployment in Marienthal. So if you enjoy documentaries, if you speak German, even if you don't and you want to vibe because it's such like an interesting like thing anyway, just for the visuals. Although the end was like it's such an interesting and beautiful scene. If you do enjoy like watching like documentaries and watching one that is like related to sociology, I do encourage like a lot watching this. Maybe there are subtitles somewhere, I don't know. And yes, I will link it on the server. I'll put it in audiovisual and media. Documentary we were talking on stream. And yeah, okay, that's enough yapping for today. I hope that it was like an interesting stream. Maybe not like the one I prepared the most. I think we could do like way more on like Marienthal, but at some point we need to stop. So thank you very much for coming. I don't know if we'll stream next week. I'm very tired and also I need to make some progress on the video, but I also need some vacation. So there is a non-zero chance that I will take like 1 or 2 weeks of true vacation starting next week to really like recover from the stress and the fatigue. And yeah, unfortunately, I've been gone for a while, but it feels good to be back. Always a pleasure yapping here and enlightening too. This is very much shared. Like as much as, you know, I'm tired, I love being here. I love like talking about things, and especially with people that are very willing to entertain like those conversations and those topics that are not necessarily easy. So anyway, I wish you the best in your you know, current curriculum, whatever like classes you are taking right now. And I will see you next time for more silliness. Bye bye.